In the summer of 2025, the headlines read like a corporate apocalypse. As reported by CBS News, Dollar Tree announced the closure of nearly 1,000 stores. The Wall Street Journal documented a growing list of shuttered Walmart supercenters across 8 states. On Bloomberg, Walmart's own CFO delivered a stark warning. Prices on everyday essentials like coffee and bananas were about to go up. This wasn't a recession. It was a self-inflicted crisis, triggered by a presidential trade policy that declared war on the very companies that feed America. How did an attempt to build economic walls lead to the collapse of America's grocery aisles? To understand the empty shelves of 2025, you have to remember the era of endless abundance. For decades, the American grocery store was a modern marvel, a testament to the power of frictionless global trade. Titans like Walmart, Kroger, and Target built empires on a simple promise: low prices, powered by hyper-efficient supply chains. Bananas from Costa Rica, coffee from Peru, cereals from Canadian grains, and household goods from China all flowed seamlessly onto American shelves. The consumer was king, and the entire global manufacturing and agricultural system was calibrated to deliver value to their shopping cart. It was a stable, predictable, and incredibly profitable ecosystem. But the foundation of that miracle began to crack under the America First doctrine. The Trump administration challenged the very premise of globalization, viewing it not as a source of American strength, but as a bad deal that had outsourced jobs. This ideological shift introduced a toxic, corrosive element into the system: radical uncertainty. The sporadic use of tariffs against China and even against allies like Canada and Mexico sent a chill through corporate boardrooms. For a company like Target, whose business model relies on sourcing 30% of its house brand goods from China, or Kroger, which depends on a steady flow of grain from Canada, political risk suddenly became a primary business concern. The core assumption of the last 40 years, that goods would flow freely and predictably, was shattered. A fundamental conflict was now inevitable, a clash between a political agenda aimed at dismantling global supply chains and a retail sector whose very existence was built upon them. The fragile peace that had defined North American commerce for a generation was shattered in the spring of 2025. In a series of aggressive moves, the Trump administration unleashed a tariff storm designed to fundamentally re-engineer the continental economy. The policy was a cudgel with multiple heads. A punishing 30% tariff was levied on most goods imported from China, a direct assault on the manufacturing engine that powered the shelves of nearly every American retailer. But the attack didn't stop there. In a move that stunned allies, a 25% tariff was imposed on most goods from Canada and Mexico, and a 20% tariff hit goods from the European Union. The stated goal was a nationalist revival. The administration argued that decades of free trade had hollowed out American industry, and that these tariffs were a necessary, albeit painful, medicine to force corporations to abandon their foreign factories and bring jobs back to U.S. soil. It was a direct challenge to the globalist consensus, a bet that the sheer gravity of the American consumer market would compel both foreign nations and domestic corporations to bend to a new reality. The strategy was rooted in a simplistic view of the economy. If imports become more expensive, companies will naturally choose to produce those goods at home. It failed to grasp the profound complexity of the modern supply chain. It saw a television set as a Chinese product, not as a device with components from a dozen different countries assembled in one and sold by an American company. It saw avocados as a Mexican product, not as a staple that keeps American grocery stores profitable and American consumers happy. The policy also targeted the intricate logistics network itself. A 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico also implicitly meant a tax on the trucks and refrigerated rail cars that moved those goods, a direct hit on the arteries of commerce. The White House believed it was punishing foreign nations, but the real targets The entities that would feel the pain most acutely were not in Beijing, Ottawa, or Mexico City. They were in Bentonville, Arkansas, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, the headquarters of the giant American retailers who had built their entire business models on the very system the administration was now trying to dismantle. The corporate response was not a quiet absorption of costs. It was an immediate and brutal wave of closures, price hikes, and profit warnings that sent shockwaves through the American economy. The first domino to fall was the biggest. As reported by Bloomberg on May 15th, Walmart's CFO, John Rainey, issued a stark public warning. The tariffs on imported produce like bananas and avocados from Mexico were non-negotiable costs, and they would be passed directly to consumers. Behind the scenes, the damage was already being done. The Wall Street Journal confirmed that at least 10 Walmart supercenters across 8 states were slated for closure. While the official reason was poor performance, industry insiders knew the truth. The tariffs had vaporized the razor-thin profit margins that kept those stores viable. Kroger, another grocery giant, followed suit. CBS News reported that the company would close approximately 60 of its stores, citing the direct impact of tariffs on essential imports like grains and rice from Canada and Mexico. This came on the heels of a federal court blocking its massive $24.6 billion merger with Albertsons, leaving the company wounded and unable to expand. Its CFO, Todd Foley, admitted they were desperately trying to restructure the supply chain, a near impossible task for perishable goods. The pain was even more acute for retailers with heavy exposure to China. On May 21st, CNBC reported that Target's sales had plummeted 3.8%, 3 times worse than forecast. Its stock lost nearly $10 billion in market value in 2 days. The reason was simple. Roughly a third of its popular high-margin private label products were sourced from China and were now subject to a 30% tax. The result for shoppers was immediate. Target began shrinking its fresh food sections and cutting back on seasonal items. But the most devastating collapse came from the lower end of the market. On June 4th, CBS News confirmed that Dollar Tree and its subsidiary, Family Dollar, would shutter nearly 1,000 stores. The company's CEO warned that the tariffs could slash its quarterly profits by 50%. The entire everything for a dollar business model, predicated on sourcing incredibly cheap goods from China and Europe, was now fundamentally broken. Even Amazon wasn't immune. Reuters reported the tech giant was closing Amazon Fresh fulfillment centers and being forced to fully merge its struggling Whole Foods division into its main grocery arm to cut losses, citing soaring logistics costs on the 66% of produce it imports from Canada and Mexico. This created a grim standoff. The White House publicly insisted that these highly profitable corporations should simply eat the costs and absorb the tariffs. But the retailers, facing investor pressure and razor-thin margins, refused or were unable to do so. They chose instead to pass the cost to consumers and close their least profitable stores. This decision had a disproportionately brutal impact on rural and low-income America. The closure of a Dollar Tree in a small town where it is the only source of affordable groceries within a 30-mile radius creates a food desert, leaving the most vulnerable populations stranded. On the other side of the border, the impact was also being felt. Canadian and Mexican suppliers, seeing their largest contracts evaporate, were forced to scale back their own operations. The policy, designed to punish foreign nations, was instead inflicting a continental crisis, hollowing out the economies of small American towns while simultaneously damaging the agricultural sectors of its closest allies. For Canada, the U.S. tariffs, while disruptive, served as a final, painful confirmation of a strategy they had already begun to embrace: aggressive diversification. The loss of contracts for grains, produce, and other goods destined for the shelves of Kroger and Whole Foods was a significant blow to Canadian farmers. However, unlike their American counterparts, Canadian businesses and government were more strategically aligned. They viewed the tariffs not as a temporary spat, but as a permanent feature of a new, more hostile trading environment. This accelerated their pivot to the world. Canadian trade missions intensified their efforts to build stronger ties with the European Union under the CETA Trade Pact and with the fast-growing markets of the Asia-Pacific through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The goal was to reroute the goods that were once destined for American supermarket shelves to new customers. While this process was costly and complex, it was seen as a necessary long-term investment in economic sovereignty. The crisis also had a notable social impact. A growing sense of frustration among Canadian consumers led to grassroots calls to buy Canadian, further weakening the sales of American brands in the Canadian market and reducing cross-border shopping trips that once sustained U.S. border towns. In the United States, the fallout was a slow-motion catastrophe for the American consumer and small-town economies. The warnings from Walmart's CFO became reality. Prices for everyday items surged. Coffee, bananas, avocados, and countless other goods that relied on imports saw significant price hikes. But the most devastating impact was the wave of store closures. The loss of nearly 1,000 Dollar Tree and Family Dollar stores, 60 Kroger locations, and a growing number of Walmarts created vast new food deserts across rural America. For a family in a small town in the Mississippi Delta or Appalachia, the closure of the local Family Dollar meant the loss of their only accessible source of affordable groceries, forcing them to drive long distances or rely on less healthy options from gas stations. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a direct threat to public health and household budgets. The policy, enacted under the banner of helping the American heartland, was actively harming its most vulnerable citizens, stripping them of access to basic necessities while simultaneously driving up the cost of living for everyone. The promise of an industrial revival felt hollow to a family staring at an empty pantry. And so, North America stands at a crossroads it never anticipated. A trade policy designed to bring jobs home has instead triggered the collapse of the very retail infrastructure that serves the nation. The United States is left with higher prices, fewer choices, and widening food deserts. Canada, while facing its own challenges, has been forced to accelerate its pivot away from its traditional partner, seeking a more stable future in a globalized world. The intricate web of supply chains that guaranteed abundance has been torn apart, not by a foreign power, but by a domestic decree.